It's May 19, 1985. Inside the bustling terminal of London's Heathrow Airport, a 46-year-old Soviet diplomat prepares to board an Aeroflot flight heading to Moscow. For a counselor at the Soviet embassy in London, a sudden call back home for a routine business consultation is not unheard of. However, this one was a little different. It was strangely urgent. As the aircraft lifts off into the grey English clouds, the man is feeling increasingly anxious. He tries to stay calm, attempting to rationalize his sudden trip. But with every mile crossed, the knot in his stomach tightens. By the time the plane begins its final approach into Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, his heart is pounding. And for a good reason. He doesn't know it yet, but this is the last time he will ever take a flight to his homeland. The man is Oleg Gordievsky, and counselor at the Soviet embassy in London is only his cover. In reality, he is a high-ranking Soviet spy. Oleg was born into the KGB. His father served in Stalin's secret police. Loyalty to the Soviet state wasn't just expected in the Gordievsky household, it was inherited. And Oleg followed the path laid out for him. Elite education, foreign languages, KGB training. By the 1960s, he was rising fast through the ranks of Soviet intelligence. But something happened along the way. While stationed in Copenhagen, Gordievsky began seeing the Soviet system from the outside. And the more time he spent in the West, the less he believed the lies back home. The breaking point came in 1968. Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, crushing the Prague Spring. To the Kremlin, it was necessary. To Gordievsky, it was proof the regime would destroy anyone who dared ask for freedom. That was the moment he made a decision that could get him executed. He would become a double agent against his own country. The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, quietly recruited him in the early 1970s. From that moment on, Oleg Gordievsky began living two lives. Publicly, he was a polished Soviet diplomat. Privately, he was one of the most valuable spies Britain had ever run. Over the next decade, Gordievsky handed MI6 an avalanche of secrets. Names of Soviet agents, KGB operations across Europe, and most dangerously of all, the mindset of the Kremlin itself. At the height of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union feared nuclear war might be unavoidable. But inside Moscow, paranoia had reached terrifying levels. The KGB genuinely believed the West might launch a surprise nuclear strike first. Gordievsky warned Britain and the Americans that the Soviet leadership was panicking, and that this fear changed everything. His intelligence helped Western leaders realize just how close the world was to catastrophe. And while MI6 celebrated the priceless information pouring out of London, inside the KGB, suspicions were beginning to grow. Somewhere in their organization, there was a traitor. They just didn't know yet. It was the man running their London station. Halfway across the world, at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a CIA officer named Aldrich Ames was growing increasingly frustrated with his career. Outside of work, his life was falling apart. He was going through a bitter divorce, and he was drowning in debt. The KGB saw an opportunity, and they recruited him, handing him a $50,000 cash payment, the first of many to come. 4 days before Oleg Gordievsky boarded that flight to Moscow, Ames handed Soviet intelligence a stack of classified documents containing the identities of Soviet agents spying for the West. Near the top of that list was Oleg Gordievsky. When Oleg steps off the aircraft at Sheremetyevo airport, the trap snaps shut. His diplomatic passport is immediately confiscated. He is told his office locks have been changed. He realizes with absolute certainty that he has been betrayed. MI6 had given him a choice before he left London. They told him he could defect. They could hide him, but Oleg knew the brutal mathematics of the Soviet regime. If he ran, his wife and his 2 young daughters back in Moscow would pay the price. They would face punishment, interrogation, and years of state harassment. To save them, he had to walk directly into the lion's den. Weeks of agonizing surveillance follow, then an invitation. Oleg is brought to a secluded, heavily guarded KGB safe house outside the city. His colleagues offer him a drink. It is laced with SP-117, a specialized, highly classified Soviet truth serum. For 5 terrifying hours, as the drug strips away his willpower, his own friends interrogate him. They know he is a mole, they just need his lips to say the words. But through sheer, agonizing, psychological strength, Oleg fights the drug. He denies everything, he gives them nothing. The KGB, frustrated and lacking a formal confession, lets him leave the safe house, but they strip him of his rank and place him under 24/7 surveillance. He is a walking dead man, and his clock is rapidly running out. Trapped in Moscow and watched around the clock, Oleg knew his days were numbered. He believed that if he stayed, imprisonment, or worse, was only a matter of time. It was time to activate the ultimate contingency, a desperate escape plan known only as Operation Pimlico. But there was just one problem. Operation Pimlico only had room for 1 passenger. Oleg would have to leave his wife and 2 young daughters behind in Moscow, knowing they would face intense interrogation and a lifetime of state surveillance. To save himself, he had to abandon the people he loved most. At exactly 7:30 in the evening, Oleg stood on a designated Moscow street corner, casually holding a plastic grocery bag from the British supermarket chain Safeway. To any passerby, he looked like an ordinary citizen. To an MI6 agent driving past, it was a silent scream for rescue. The diplomat caught his eye, walked past him holding a candy bar, the counter signal confirming the rescue was on, and the wheels of Pimlico began to turn. Days later, having briefly shaken his tail, Oleg was on a local bus heading toward the heavily fortified Finnish border. As the bus slowed down near a dense patch of forest, he suddenly jumped from the moving vehicle directly into the brush, vanishing from sight. He lay frozen behind a massive roadside boulder for hours, fighting off swarming mosquitoes, terrified that any movement would alert the border patrols. Finally, the faint crunch of tires broke the silence. 2 cars with British diplomatic plates pulled into a remote gravel lay-by. With no time for words, Oleg broke from the trees and curled his body tightly into the cramped, sweltering trunk of the vehicle. As the cars approached the border checkpoint, the tension reached a breaking point. The Soviet border guards ordered the diplomats out. Suddenly, the deep, frantic barking of KGB tracking dogs echoed through the night. Oleg lay frozen in total darkness, barely daring to breathe as he heard canine claws scratching directly against the metal bumper of the trunk. A quick-thinking British diplomat walked to the back of the car, opened a bag of strong cheese and onion potato chips, and dropped them near the dogs, completely shattering their sense of smell. The distracted guards waved the diplomatic cars through the gates. The trunk lid opened. Beyond it was Finland. For the first time in months, Oleg Gordievsky was beyond the reach of the KGB. He was free, but he would never see his homeland again. From Finland, Oleg was smuggled to London, where Britain granted him political asylum. Back in Moscow, the Kremlin was furious. The KGB's most wanted double agent had escaped. Oleg was sentenced to death for treason and absentia, a sentence that was never formally revoked. For years, he lived under constant protection in Britain, knowing he could never safely return home. But there was one thing he feared he had lost forever: his family. When Oleg crossed the Finnish border, he was forced to leave behind his wife and 2 daughters in Moscow. For nearly 6 years, they remained trapped inside the Soviet Union. Then, in 1991, as the Soviet system itself began to crumble, they were finally allowed to leave and reunite with him in Britain. Oleg Gordievsky spent the rest of his life in England, where he died in 2022 at the age of 83. He never returned to Russia. But the secrets he carried out changed the course of the Cold War and may have helped prevent its most dangerous misunderstandings from becoming something far worse.